Good morning, friends. So this morning I want to talk to you about pleasure. The reason I want to talk about pleasure is because the church hardly ever talks about pleasure, and also I kind of like the way the word pleasure rolls off the tongue, so I might say it a lot this morning. The English essayist F.W. Bornham said a long time ago, he said, "Laughter, merriment and fun were quite evidently intended to occupy a large place in our world, and yet on no subject under the sun has the church displayed more embarrassment or confusion." And for me that nails it. In a church environment like our own, we are really comfortable talking about life's disappointments, but we are not so comfortable talking about pleasure. And so consequently, it hardly ever crosses our mind as to how we might seek God's wisdom to help us think through the pleasures that we so enjoy and that our culture so willingly offers. I think that in a church environment, we should not be at all uncomfortable talking about pleasure. Our worldview, after all, is Christian. We believe that we are somehow creatures who have a creator. It logically follows, therefore, that part of the reason why we find pleasure to be pleasurable is because God made us that way. From the tips of our toes to the neurons firing in our brains, we believe, have been given by our good, loving and kind God the capacity for experiencing incredible pleasure. Every civilization that has ever left its archaeological mark upon this planet has left material testimony to the fact that fun is an integral part of life. For example, here is a doll from ancient Egypt. It's made out of a paddle. It's one of the paddle dolls from the Middle Kingdom, if you're a history nerd. So this is essentially a 4,000-year-old Barbie. This comes from a time when our species had hardly figured out anything. And yet one of the first things they figured out was that fun is fun. Fun is necessary. Next slide, same idea, also from ancient Egypt. Look at what the woman is doing in this image. She's playing a board game. In this case, the game is Senet. It's an ancient Egyptian game where good battles evil for supremacy over the world. A theme not too dissimilar from many of the games we play on PlayStation or Xbox. It seems this need for fun is innate in all of us. We are born, I think, with a desire to enjoy life. So here are two truths, and they both matter. Truth number one: we have a God-given need for pleasure. Truth number two: the culture in which we live brilliantly offers us an ever-broadening range of pleasure possibilities. And there are pleasures available today that hadn't even been invented 20 years ago. And both of these truths leave us with a dilemma that we have to think through. And that is, how might we pursue our God-given needs for pleasure without doing damage to ourselves, to our relationships, and to our futures? Let me say that again. Here's what we're trying to figure out. How do we pursue our God-given need for pleasure without at the same time doing damage to ourselves, to our relationships, and to our futures? Interestingly, one of the writers in the Bible also tried to figure this out. In the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament, there's a section, a really peculiar section, in which a deeply thoughtful man devotes his mind to thinking through the whole pleasure question. He says this: "I thought in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good." In other words, I woke up one day and I decided for myself that I would do some experimentation in pleasure. I decided that I was going to try things, I was going to experience things, I was going to taste things, I was going to touch things, and in all of that experimentation, I was going to figure out what I like and what I don't like. What gives me pleasure, what doesn't give me pleasure. Because I recognize on the inside of me, I have this need, this desire to experience pleasure. There are lots of pleasure possibilities out there available to me in my particular culture, and I need to figure out what's good for me, what works for me, and what doesn't. And so I'm going to experiment. Sounds okay. And like any good experiment, he keeps a record of the things he tries, of the things he experiences and tastes and so on. He goes on. He says, laughter, I said, is foolish. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, all the while my mind guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was worthwhile for men to do under heaven during the few days of their lives. So, with the dedication of a scientist, he said, I'm going to go out and do all this stuff. And I'm going to start by laughing. Laughing is good. I've noticed that people like to laugh, so I gave that a shot. And then he said, I'm going to embrace folly. I'm going to do silly stuff. I'm going to devote my life to silliness, like bungee jumping. I'm going to stay in my basement and play Halo for 4 hours a day. I'm going to dedicate myself to the business of being a layabout. That's what he's saying in this particular verse. I was the guy who never got changed out of his boxer shorts. I was the guy who stayed in his mother's basement all day long, eating Cheetos and playing computer games and looking at memes on the internet. I did that. I tried that. And while I was doing it, I did it with the mind of a scientist. I was recording how I was feeling and what I was experiencing. I was doing an experiment in pleasure, but that's not all I did. In addition to being a layabout, I also undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. Interestingly, the word parks in that sentence is not a Hebrew word, it's a Persian word, pardizim. Can you guess what pardizim means in Persian? Paradise. See what he's saying? I made for me a paradise for me. I created for me a perfect world for me. I made reservoirs of water groves, flourishing trees. I had male and female slaves and other slaves in my house. I owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of man. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And in all this, notice, my wisdom stayed with me. So not only did he pour himself into having a good time, he poured himself into the arts, into viticulture, into architecture, into business. And in all the things he tried, it seems he was successful. And his recorded testimony is that as he lived a hard, fast, driven, high-achieving life, he did so all the time with the inquiring mind of a scientist. This for him wasn't about pleasure and success and art and architecture. It was about figuring out what worked and what didn't work. It was about figuring out what made him feel good in life and what didn't make him feel good in life. And to a degree, his experiment, it seems, yielded positive results. He says in verse 10, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. So for him, there wasn't a pleasure dilemma of the sort I alluded to at the beginning. He simply woke up in the morning and felt a need for pleasure. And he dove right into all of the pleasure possibilities that were available to him in his particular culture. And it kind of worked. There was no restraint. There was no There was no moral compass. There was no ethical code. There was just, I feel like, so I will do. Look at what he says. Having done all of that, my heart took delight in all my work. It kind of worked, he's saying. I found pleasure in achievement. I found pleasure in success. I found pleasure in silliness. I found pleasure in excess. It made me feel good. But worryingly, he doesn't end there. Worryingly and confusingly, he goes on to say that all of that left him feeling empty and cynical. My heart took delight in all my work, but here is the reward I got for everything. When I surveyed all that my hands had done and all that I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. It was all a chasing after the wind, and here is what I found. Nothing was gained under the sun. This, for me, captures the complexity of life perfectly. I can, at the same time, live for pleasure, find pleasure in that pleasure, and yet at the end of the day be left feeling cynical, empty, and unfulfilled. This is a mystery. In his book, Happiness is a Choice, Dr. Paul Meyer says this: I have had millionaire businessmen come to my office and tell me that they have big houses, yachts, apartments in Colorado, nice children, a beautiful mistress, an unsuspecting wife, secure corporate positions, and suicidal tendencies. How can that be? How does 1 add 1 equal 2 in that paragraph? How can I live for pleasure, find pleasure in that pleasure, and yet nevertheless feel cynical and empty and frustrated about life on the inside? That doesn't make sense. The only clue this writer leaves for us is the phrase, everything under the sun was chasing the wind. This is an ancient Hebrew phrase which means something like, I didn't think it through right. I didn't think this right. I pursued pleasure unthinkingly. I didn't stop to ask, is this going to damage me tomorrow? Is it going to damage my relationships, my future? I didn't really have wisdom in my pursuit and need of pleasure. I had fun, absolutely. Absolutely. You wouldn't believe the fun I had. But the fun I had ruined me and ruined those around me. So back to our dilemma. How do I pursue my God-given desire for pleasure without at the same time damaging myself, my relationships, and my future? How do I enjoy all of the things that my culture has to offer, and they are many, and getting manier, without spoiling myself? To help us think through this dilemma, I want to give you 3 principles that I hope will help you and I together make wiser decisions. I've taken the first principle from a rather remote story in the Old Testament book of Judges. So the background to this story is that Israel is at war, and their general, a man called Gideon, is just about to fight a key battle. The story says this: early in the morning, Gideon and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. So at this point, what's going on in the story is they're all doing their last-minute battle preparations. They're sharpening their swords, they're checking their weapons, that kind of thing. Then in verse 2, we're told that the Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men." What? Too many men. No. I can do with some more. I'm about to fight people here. There's no such thing as too many men. What are you talking about? God seems to be saying to Gideon here, I want this fight not to be about how skilled you are or about how extensive your resources happen to be. I want this to be a demonstration of what I can do in your life. So I want you to trim the herd a little. So I want you to go to your army and say to them, if any of you are scared, well, that'd be everyone, I think. If any of you are scared, you can go home and we'll take care of it. So Gideon does this, and then we're told that 22,000 of them went home. 10,000 remained. At this point, Gideon is probably thinking, well, that's great. I had 32,000 men this morning, now I've got 10,000. I can still do something with 10,000 men. Next sentence, but the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. No, God, there aren't. There's not enough. This morning I had enough, now I have less than enough. Now you want me to have even less than enough. So God says, no, this is going to be about a miracle. So take the 10,000 men down to the river, and I will sift them for you. Then notice this. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go, send him home. So Gideon took the men down to the river. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. So understand what this sentence is saying. I want you to notice the people who kind of scoop water up into their hands and go like this. And I want you to notice the other people who just go up to the river and stick their head in it and, drink it dry. Those are the two kinds of people I want you to look for. Then we're told 300 men lapped the water with their hands like this. All the rest of them stuck their head in the river and just did what came naturally. The Lord said to Gideon, with 300 men that lapped the water with their hands, I will save you. Now, the consensus of opinion on this is that God is testing their alertness. If you're at a water source, in the ancient world, water sources are key geographical features in the art of war. And at that water source, you're sticking your head in the river, not paying attention to what's going on around you. You're not being a good soldier. Whereas if you're taking water in your hand and you're going like this, you're alert, you're looking at what's happening around you. That's the story, here's the principle. There's nothing wrong with drinking water. Is that a fair statement? Is it further fair to say that given that this story happens in the desert, that every single one of these 10,000 men is thirsty? It's a hot day, and that drinking water on a hot day when you're thirsty is a legitimate pleasure in 100% of cases. Is that a fair statement? Yes. Absolutely. However, only 300 of those men enjoyed that pleasure without allowing it to distract them from their purpose as soldiers. If you're taking notes, here's the first principle. Any pleasure that refreshes you without diminishing you is a legitimate pleasure. Any pleasure that refreshes you without diminishing you is a legitimate pleasure. Conversely, any pleasure that refreshes you but diminishes you is an illegitimate pleasure. So, for example, sex. Sex is a legitimate pleasure. Fair statement. Oh, okay. But sex that is wrong, sex that is contrary to your moral code, to your ethics as a Christian, diminishes you, makes you less than God intended you to be. Making money is a legitimate pleasure. Fair statement. But making money dishonestly makes you less than God intended you to be. Skiing is a legitimate pleasure. But taking a sick day off work so that you can go skiing makes you less than God intended you to be. Do you get the idea? Pleasures that refresh you without diminishing you are legitimate and are to be embraced. The second principle comes from an equally remote story from the life of David. So in this particular story, David is at war, and he's hiding out in a cave with a few of his men. It's one of those hot, sticky nights, and David, as I suppose soldiers often do, is thinking about the comforts of home. And he just spouts out. He says, you know what I would really enjoy right now? You know what I'd really love? Do you know what would make this night just go awesome? A drink of cool water from that well in my hometown of Bethlehem that happens to be behind enemy lines. I would love a drink of water from that well behind enemy lines. Then he goes to sleep. A few of his soldiers say, you know, we should do that for him. So they sneak off. They risk their lives. They go behind enemy lines. They grab him a thermos of this water, and they take it back and they say, "Hey, David, guess what we did? We went and got you some of that water that you love from behind enemy lines." David looks at the water, and in a moment of high drama, he pours the water onto the ground and says this: "Far be it from me, O Lord, to drink this. No way I can drink this water. For it is the blood of men who went at the risk of their own lives," and he refused to drink it. In other words, he refused to give himself a pleasure that risked the life of another. This gives us our second principle. Any pleasure that jeopardizes the rights of another person is an illegitimate pleasure. And this is more subtle than we might imagine. We might have to think about things like, is it legitimate for me to play golf all day on Saturday and go fishing with my friends on a Sunday when my family haven't seen me all week? Is that legitimate? Is it legitimate for me to spend $2,000 on a new mountain bike when I'm not saving any money at all for my children's education? Don't they have a right to be provided for and looked after? Any pleasure that jeopardizes the rights of another person is illegitimate, damaging, and to be avoided. The third principle I've taken from the book of Proverbs, which says this: my buffet-loving friends, if you find honey, eat just enough of it. Too much and you'll vomit. So the principle here is that honey is a good thing. However, too much of a good thing is not a good thing. For example, I rather enjoy reading history magazines and watching anything about history on television. And according to our first few principles, that's absolutely fine. It's a legitimate pleasure. It refreshes me. It does not diminish me. It is enjoyed, typically not at the expense of others. So with a free conscience, I can watch and enjoy a program about Operation Sea Lion in World War II. No prick to my conscience whatsoever. However, according to this third principle, if I spend 5 hours a day watching the History Channel, my legitimate pleasure becomes an illegitimate pleasure. Balance is the spice of life. Playing games on your Xbox, fine. Going to the gym, fine. Playing golf, fine. Fishing, fine. Skiing, fine. Whatever, fine. But too much of a fine thing can eat into other areas of your life and become destructive. So here is our third principle. Any pleasure, however good, however righteous, if not kept in balance, will become damaging. God created us, I think, to enjoy life. You know, that's an important statement. At the moment, those of you who are parents are probably thinking about the things you're going to put under the tree. Right? You've already given thought to how Christmas morning is going to go, and you've already got a picture in your mind's eye of how much you're going to enjoy watching your children open gifts, and that's important to you. Is it so hard to imagine that if what we believe is true, if this life we have is a gift of God, that God wishes for us to enjoy that gift to the fullest? Is that so hard to imagine? Is that so hard to grasp? God wishes for us to enjoy it all, to embrace with enthusiasm, I think, the recreational, material, and relational pleasures of this world. Pleasure, we must believe, was God's idea. However, it is fair also to say that in our pursuit of pleasures, we easily go down wrong roads and blind alleys, and seek pleasures from things that, although pleasurable at the time, diminish us and damage us, and ruin our relationships, and violate the rights of others, and bring imbalance to our lives. All because we don't think things through. So, we can become one of two things. We can become monks or nuns and lock ourselves away from the world and deny ourselves all but the most basic of pleasures. Be the kind of persons who are satisfied with a bowl of gruel a day and itchy underpants. The itchier the better. That'll do us. Sign me up for a life of stoical misery. Turn off my hot water, don't need it. All that stuff. We can go down that road. Or we can embrace as a gift of God our need for pleasure, and actively seek to satisfy that need by following God's wisdom, recognizing that all pleasures, while pleasurable, are not all legitimate. Some make us less than God intended us to be. Some are enjoyed at the expense of others, and some bring imbalance and disorder to our lives. Hard to think through. I wish you fun as you think through it. God bless you. See you next time.